Thank you very much for the intro. I will whip through the theory of circular economy and conclude by saying, yes, of course we should regulate it because we're not doing enough of it. And the whole panel session earlier turned to circular economy and said, look, what we're doing in the circular economy is fantastic. We're doing containers, we're doing packaging, and all of that adds up to maximum 4% of the Australian waste stream. So there's plenty of upside opportunity to do more of it and have more stories like Close the Loop. And there are very few voluntary schemes where industry go in voluntarily and stump up their own money. And all of the Australian product stewardship schemes, except for a couple of voluntary ones, have been either with regulation or the threat of regulation, more so the threat of regulation. So what is the circular economy? An economy that's restorative, regenerative by design and aims to keep products, components and materials at their highest utility and value at all times, distinguish them in technical and biological cycles. So we're going to recycle all this stuff, but we're not just going to recycle, we're going to maintain it, collect it, reuse it, refurbish it and recycle it. All the blue stuff around on the right-hand side of that circle. So it's not just about recycling, it's about changing the supply chain. But how do you do that? Why on earth would a company that's making profit out of a linear supply chain be bothered? And that's unfortunately the reality of the linear economy we work in, that unless there's a driver that changes that, willingly or unwillingly, then we're stuck with the linear economy. And so it's obvious that government have to intervene into this space, either to create market signals that allow companies to make profit doing what Closed Loop is doing, or you regulate them because they don't have the right price signals. Bottom line is, we've been talking about circular economy for a decade. Are we further along? Well, yes, but are we successful at it? Not very. If you look at the EU, they have said there's probably $630 billion worth of value for the European countries in getting the circular economy right. That's conservative, $630 billion. Just for complex durables, so just for the kinds of materials we've just heard about, plus agriculture, plus other streams. And also, circular economy has the effect of putting reused product back into the economy, which has the effect of dampening the price of materials in the economy. It flows through. And as I mentioned in the last session, we recycle already about 26 million tonnes of product into the Australian economy. That has the effect of dampening paper prices, dampening plastic prices, dampening glass prices, albeit we have a bit of a problem with glass at the moment. But the point is the circular economy feeds the whole economy, but we as a recycling sector don't get any recognition for that. And we need to elevate the circular economy debate in the minds of government. There's also plenty of jobs. There are green-collar jobs in the circular economy. I think you said 75 in Australia and 120 around the world just doing toner cartridges. We employ 34,000 people in the Australian recycling sector and waste sector. There's no reason that can't double. And I gave a presentation last year that said our expectations would be that employment in our sector would increase to 100,000 people within the next 15 years. If we follow the kind of pathway that New South Wales is doing with levy, price signals, circular economy. And if you look at, say, take Denmark as an example, the impact of the circular economy in their mind is about 3% growth in GDP, 3% growth in employment, and a 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of reprocessing material streams. Huge benefits for the economy, huge benefits for employment. And in comparison to Australia, if you look at the economic effect, they say 6.7, 3 and 70 is the Australian effect of those things. It's also good for profit. We've just heard that. A couple of companies, Remondis, Tomra, both here at this conference. 20% cumulative growth in Tomra, which is a packaging container deposit scheme, sorting equipment supplier. Remondis, general waste service and recycling provider, massive in Europe, 10 and 20% growth rates. And it's better for you and I as consumers. There's kind of price signals that we get in terms of reduced, in this case, washing machine costs. Everything's cheaper because there's cheaper input materials. So where are we now? Well, This is the Australian story. We're growing our waste streams by a cumulative 6.2% per annum. It will double in the next 10 years at least. At that, the good news story is that while we're growing our waste generation, we're growing our recycling rate at the same rate. So consequently, all of the growth in waste generation has been picked up by a better and more efficient recycling system. But recycling is not the circular economy, and we've got to get away from the idea that the recycling sector just picks up the end of the economic linear process and shoves it back in. That is an important part of it, but we've got to get into the manufacturing thinking of the generators and the linear part of the economy, not just solve the problem at the back end. And to take the analogy, Albert's analogy of the plumbing, at the end of the pipe, we're very good at resurfacing the plumbing of the economy. But we've got to get back up to the brain, the hands and the legs and make sure they start thinking about waste. We're the fourth highest waste generator in the world, which is not anything to brag about, but it's a direct function of 21 years of economic growth. And our waste is growing at 6 times GDP. So, we haven't uncoupled those. 6 times population and 2.5 times GDP. So we haven't uncoupled waste generation from economic growth, and that's what the circular economy is trying to do. And if we stick with what we're doing right now, we will be generating about 100 million tonnes in 2036, not very long away, and we will need to be recovering 103 million tonnes compared to the 26 we're recycling right now, and we would send about 5.5 million tonnes to landfill. And to do that, we need to grow our recycling capacity by about 5 million tonnes per annum, pretty much just to stay still. So, what's the government? My argument, the government must intervene. We've had, and I'll turn to a slide in a moment, some fairly small-scale attempts at circular economy around products, not very much around manufacturing, not very much about circular economy thinking. Skip that. So the policy interventions I want to talk about are the bottom 3, because the top 4, we do those, but they're very hands-off. I want to talk more about interventionist policies, regulatory, fiscal and structural frameworks. Right, so the regulatory framework. Decide on the metrics, agree on the targets and get on with it. It needs a national approach because Section 92 of the Constitution says you can't interfere with interstate trade and commerce, and we're seeing 600,000 tonnes of waste go from Sydney up to Brisbane every year. Why? Because the governments can't get their act together on the constitutional aspects of Section 92, which says you can't interfere with interstate trade and commerce. So unless Queensland introduces their own levy, we will continue to see 600,000 tonnes of material that should be going back into the productive economy and be available to recyclers in New South Wales that's going to cheap $10 landfills in Queensland. So I've got to get the structure right. Otherwise, as mentioned in the last meeting, you won't build C&I dirty MRFs. You won't build the kind of infrastructure that we need. Disposal bans, I mentioned in the last session. They're the bans that are happening. They're not very interventionist. They're not very wide scale. They're usually limited to dangerous or high-risk material streams. Queensland has articulated a view that it should be more proactive in banning particular streams from landfill, more your average streams like organics and mixed paper, etc. So we hope that Queensland takes a lead in that space. Potential bans, now this is what's happening in Europe. These are the kinds of materials that are banned regularly by European states from landfill. I would encourage the federal government and the states to start a discussion around specific bans around these material streams. And the Australian EPR scheme, circular economy scheme if you like, the only regulatory system we have was it's a co-regulatory arrangement between TVs and computers, and all the rest are voluntary. There is, of course, in the national EPR scheme legislation, the opportunity for mandated schemes, but the federal government has not. We don't have any mandated schemes in the country, and I say we need to move more specifically into mandating some of these because it's not in the interests of most companies in the linear economy to move unless they have a price signal or a regulatory signal. I don't care which, but if we want this stuff out of landfill, then we need to intervene more forcefully. And these are the kinds of schemes that EU member states have mandated, which should be the starting list for an Australian scheme. And these are the voluntary schemes coming out of Europe. Again, that should be the list for the federal government. It makes an enormous amount of sense that that list just be picked up. We know those schemes work in Europe. We should just be able to translate them directly into the Australian market. Turning to the Australian list, I don't know how many of you know how EPR works in Australia, but every year, every couple of years, the federal government puts out a list and says we are going to think about introducing an EPR arrangement around these materials. But there's no process leading up to that list, and there's no process for reviewing the list, and there's no process for how things get off the list. And things do get off the list, they just fall off. And you'll see some of those have been on the list since 2013-14, and we still don't have arrangements around them. Having said that, we do have a couple of really successful EPR schemes in this country. TVs and computers is an outrageous success due to some of the companies in this room. Close-the-loop container cartridges, fantastic success. In that case, voluntary. In the case of the packaging scheme, the electrical and computer scheme, co-regulatory. So the challenges, our list is very short, it's very unambitious. Products come on and off the list without much discussion or rationale. The federal government, let's be frank, has not put a lot of effort into this space in really the last decade. And EPR is pivotal to the circular economy. It's just not going to happen unless we introduce some of these schemes more forcefully. And what should be covered in Australia? Well, that's just my checkpoint list. For those of you who are interested in what Europe is doing, that would make sense as a minimum list. The fiscal framework, I'm not going to go into GST, but we can change the GST regime if we wanted to. On the positive side, New South Wales Waste Less, Recycle More has put about $40 million into programs that recover material streams and 465 into the general recycling sector. There will be another 337 million over the next 4 years. So New South Wales is doing a good job, but not getting much support at the national level for some of those material streams that I mentioned. One of the things that Europe does really well that we should have a serious look at is a Circular Economy Commission, not dissimilar to the Productivity Commission, that reviews what materials should go onto these schemes, how would they run, put some impetus and investment behind a commission independent of government to say what should go into a circular economy mechanism. I think that would be a fantastic first step and something I'd argue that WAMA and ACOR and others should be taking up if they're not already. And I'm not sure, Grant, if you're speaking, but that would be something I'd love to get some feedback on from ACOR. No doubt ACOR has looked seriously at some of this stuff. So should we regulate the circular economy? The answer is yes. And we should use much more interventionist policies to drive the circular economy. It's not happening for a host of reasons, and regulators can enable system-wide benefits to be achieved that cannot be achieved through self-interested actions of individual partners or individual companies. We shouldn't expect them to. There's only so many voluntary decisions that Westpac or Adani is going to make. They are going to act in their own self-interest. That is the role of a company. So if we want them to do something else, we need to provide the environment to do it. The analogy I have always used is you put a lion and a sheep in a cage. It's not in the interests of the lion to not eat the sheep. Don't ask them to, because they won't. What you have to do is put a fence between the two and let the lion do what lions do and the sheep do what sheep do. And the government, the regulator, needs to create the fence and the environment in which companies can and will do the right thing. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.